This unit is all about immigration, and I'm going to take you through the pathway of immigration in the United States, starting from the land bridge, yeah, that's a long time ago, to modern day. And that's going to go all the way up to like the Trump administration, okay? So let's get started with immigration, but before we do, I want you to look at these wonderful words that some of you guys might be able to recite yourself, at least part of it, because you've heard it before. Here we go, from Emma Lazarus. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shores, send these, the homeless, the tempest tossed. To me, I lift my lamp beside the golden door. A message found on the base of the Statue of Liberty. A message to immigrants coming to our shores. There was a counter message, somebody who wanted the opposite of Emma Lazarus, and that was Prescott Hall. Here's his message to immigrants. Enough, enough. We want no more of ye immigrant from a foreign shore. Already is our land overrun, or overrun is how we would actually understand it. So these two messages are important. Bring me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. The other one says, no more. And I want you to think about what is the actual message? What is the ideology? What is the belief of the United States? Is it that of Emma Lazarus? Or that of Prescott Hall? And as we're going through this unit, I want you to keep that in your mind. Do we more likely represent the message that's on the base of the Statue of Liberty, or the message of Prescott Hall saying, no more immigrants? So we just talked about these two ideologies, these two ideas, these two ways of thinking about immigration. We got Prescott Hall, which says, no more immigrants. Then you have the one, the only, Emma Lazarus, who says, bring on the immigrants. We'll take your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. And we're going to think about, where do you think America is right now? Which camp do they fall in? The one that's next to the Statue of Liberty, or the one that Prescott Hall was stated, which all the other anti-immigration people were stating for years, like over a century? Where we sit, Prescott Hall, Emma Lazarus. So let's talk about the fact that, man, we are a country of immigration. This right here shows like a flow chart of immigration to our country. You'll see the different countries that people are immigrating from Ireland, Germany, which we're going to talk about today in this video. We're going to talk about Italy, just a little bit, maybe a little Russia, maybe a little Mexico. We're going to talk about all these today. You see, what we call ourselves is a melting pot. You see? A melting pot is this old thing that was used to basically melt all these metals together. Okay? So you just put all these different metals in the pot, and you heat it up, and it'll mix together into this nice, wonderful thing that has multiple metals together. We are a melting pot of ideas, culture, languages, because we are a country that has taken on a lot of immigrants. Our foundation is immigration. Our colonists were immigrants from Europe that came over here and established the government that we have today. So we have been a nation of immigration. And we continually grow as a nation of immigration. Now I want to talk about some of the first immigrants over to the Americas. They get kind of like, we're not talking about Native Americans, right? First settlers over here. They did this over a land bridge. Can't see that right there. But there used to be a land bridge between Russia and now Alaska. And this is where they migrate down, and they basically just different tribes broke off, and they took over the entire continents of the United States, as well as South America and Central America. Then we have the settlers that will come in during colonization. See, I'm jumping one big time from ice bridge to colonization, right? And you have different ones. You have Britain, France, you have Spain. They're kind of cutting up, carving out this new land, the Americas, right? The United States, as well as Central America, and also South America too. So they're cutting it up. And then we have more populations come in after the United States becomes a nation. And that's what we're going to get into today. Now, we talked about the immigration from Africa, which majority of it was African slaves. Not even wanting to come over here, forced to come over here. But there's also the wanted immigration, the groups of people that came over here for opportunity, possibility. In 1790, I want to talk about one law that was passed called the Naturalization Act of 1790. I'm going to read a portion of it to you to understand how our forefathers, the founding fathers, the people who made the Constitution, what they were thinking about immigration. Here, I'm going to read a portion of it. The Naturalization Act of 1790 allows any, here we go, direct quotes from the thing, free white person of good character. Now, that idea of good character is kind of a wiggle room. What makes a good character? Is it somebody that works hard? Okay. What if they work hard but they're bad to people? Okay, works hard and are good to people. What if they work hard, they're good for people, but they don't really like working well with others. It's all about them. They'll be nice to you at their own means. So this idea of white person, good character, this was one of our founding documents, really. It's one of the first laws passed that had to do with immigration. It's not in our Constitution, but it is a law passed shortly after the Constitution became a Constitution, and that was basically putting a bar up that people had to meet before they can come in. So this is the idea. This is the introduction of our idea of immigration, 1790. Now we're going to take that 1790 and we're going to explore the huge boom of immigration that happens after to the late 1800s all the way up to present day. We're going to take a look at it. Remember, examining through Emma Lazarus versus Prescott Hall. Let's get at it. First batch of immigration I want to talk about is 1815 to like 1879. So basically 1800s. And there's two groups that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the Irish immigration and the German immigration, what their experiences was, why they came here. Let's talk about the Irish first. So the Irish came over here for a bunch of reasons. You're going to find that some of them are kind of the same as other groups. They wanted religious freedom. They had poor conditions, and they wanted better opportunity for themselves as well as their next generation of children. They want indentured servants or serving in the British Army. They kind of were forced to come over here. They came here for farmland, and also one big thing to remember, there was a huge potato famine that took place in the 1800s, and potatoes was their like number one source of food. So when this thing went, people started to starve. So they're like, let's hitch a ride over to those Americas and see how we do over here. Now you have to wonder, how were they received? You have this influx, a large group of Irish Americans that are coming, Irish immigrants coming over here to the Americas to really like live the dream that America promises. Well, let's see how that they're incorporated. This right here are primary sources. They're images that you would actually see throughout towns and newspapers, and we're going to talk about them. So this one right here, no Irish need apply. This is something that you would actually see, help wanted, no Irish, in actual windows back in the day. Basically saying, if you want to work here, you better not be Irish because I'm not going to hire you. The thought was, the fear tactic was, the idea was that the Irish are here to steal our jobs. These are tropes. These are things that will come up over and over again about immigrants. Every immigrant group I'm going to talk about, at one point or another were the threat to take away jobs. In reality is, yes, they did take jobs, but they also produced jobs. They also produced things in the economy that allowed people to flourish, to allow people to make money. So it was a give and take like anything else. Here's another thing that they saw this is a political cartoon, which, by the way, you're going to have to get used to reading and understanding. This political cartoon shows Uncle Sam, which is the representation of America. When you see Uncle Sam, he represents what America is, at least the idea of America. And it says the land of the free back here. And it shows a group of immigrants. These are Irish immigrants. And it shows literacy tests. Remember, these are going to be poorer groups that are coming here to try to make the names for themselves, try to make a better living for their family. Poorer groups typically don't know how to read. So having a literacy test to ban people from coming over was basically a way of preventing immigration from the Irish, German, and other groups because they knew the poorest people wouldn't know how to read. It was a limitation on people's ability to try to become more free than what they were. So let's talk about the German experience. The German experience came here because of political refuge. That means like they wanted to be able to participate in politics without the threat of death. They also came here for religious refuge. They wanted to be able to believe what they wanted to believe and worship who they want to worship without the threat of death or others. And the refuge of the German army. Basically, they were constructed. They had to work. They had to serve in the army. They didn't want to. They didn't want to work for the Kaiser. So they came over here to get away from that ideology. Here's some things that you would see the German immigrants would have to see. To German and Austro-Americans, men and women of German and Austrian blood, we ask you to remember that this is your country now. Sounds pretty good so far. Here's where it kind of turns for the worse. You owe no allegiance to your king or the Kaiser. They were, Americans were afraid that these German immigrants were going to side with the Kaiser, the people, the leader of a country they left to leave for religious persecution, being made to work in the military, and all these other things. It was an insult. It's kind of similar to the internment of Japanese Americans. It was the assumption that, well, you're originally from Japan, so you must be just like them, or you could be just as dangerous as Japan is after Pearl Harbor, so we're going to put you in internment camps. It's this stereotyping and putting them in a bubble that really isn't fair. Here is one that's going to make you probably go, hey. This is a image, political cartoon that you would actually see back in the day, but a political image of Germans hanging from a tree. Yeah. And what it says here, if this town goes dry, U.S. Germans will hang together. What this was another stereotype of Germans. Stereotype being that they are just a bunch of drunkards. You see how, like, groups of people are basically put in these buckets of bad? Like, these people are going to steal our jobs, and these people, all they do is drink all the time. It's this idea that perpetuates fear and anger towards groups of people. And this happens to every immigrant group in our history. It just, that is what happens, is they're the other, they are different. And this happened to German immigrants like it did to the Irish immigrants. And a lot of this was perpetrated by the Know Nothing Party, basically an anti-immigrant group that we'll talk about later in class. So this is the first two groups of people we're talking about. We have the Irish, we have the German. How did immigrants get to the U.S.? Well, by boat, of course. Ship would be more appropriate because it was pretty big. However, ships may be big, doesn't mean that you're going to have a lot of space to enjoy life. So there's two different places. There's steerage and there's cabin spacing for people that are traveling across the Atlantic and also the Pacific, but I'm going to focus mostly on the Atlantic for this one. So if you're coming to America, more likely you're poor. And if you're poor, in order to hitch a ride to get all the way to America, you're probably going to go to the steerage side. Steerage side was rough, folks. The steerage side was close quarters. You can't really tell because the image, this is pretty packed, but you might be able to see here. Here's the sleeping quarters. They're basically these little cutout shelves that people would sleep on. And you're talking, month or so on the ship. So it's tough, it's rough, and you're next to people, pretty tight quarters. This right here, you can see the huge population sitting on the deck of the ship. Now, these people would have to be funneled into steerage, and steerage was a place where things were loaded. There was objects down there to make it comfortable. It was tight quarters, so you have to worry about disease. You also have to worry about eating because there was the food situation down there for people who took steerage. It was rough. You were only given certain portions of food throughout your travel. Again, people are leaving a horrible condition through a horrible method to go somewhere where the promised land is, like a place that hopefully is going to be better for them than where they're coming from. And that's what they're hoping for. Now, if you're fancy enough, if you're rich enough, you could pay for a cabin. Cabin a place would be a place where you have your own individual room. You're not going to be stuck basically into those little shelving units where you would sleep most of the trip over. So cabin would be more of if you're a wealthier type person than the steerage. But this is kind of how they came over. I mean, this is the method to which that they were living. You can see here, there's a whole little family here, and this is actually would be a cabin seating because they actually have a bed. They have their own little nook of areas. It's still close quarters, but compared to steerage, this was living it up. This was being on the higher end of things when coming to America. Eventually, in 1875, to follow chronology a little bit better, the Supreme Court does rule that it's the government's responsibility to basically declare laws on, enforce immigration laws, and this will change some things in the future. All right, let's get to where they would get dropped off at. Nations that would take in immigrants from the sea. You had on the Pacific side, Angel Island, and you had the Atlantic side, you have Ellis Island. Now, Ellis Island is located in New York. This took immigrants from Germany, Italy, Ireland, basically Europe. Europe is where the immigration would come through Ellis Island. Angel Island on the west coast, close to California, that one is going to be like people immigrating from Japan and China. Now, the experiences they have when they come over here, a little bit different. I will tell you this, the treatment of people coming from Japan and from Asia was not as great as the experience from those people coming from Europe. Not saying that people come from Europe, their experience was wonderful, but just know that as levels of issues and disrespect and just, the people coming to Angel Island had more difficulty. And one of the reasons why it may be, they had different culture than most of the people here. We had German ancestry, we had Irish ancestry, we had Italian ancestry already here. So even though people may not have been treated exactly equal, they were treated better than those people from Japan and China because there was just less ancestry from them, and they were treated pretty bad. So let's talk about what it's like. So you go to Ellis Island, and what you do is it's a two-step process. You first have a physical exam. So you get off the boat. They do a physical exam on you. They basically check you over. They do this thing where they actually open up your eyelid and they look into your eye to see if there's a disease. They just do a full disease check. If you are too diseased or too sick, they basically put you back in the boat and send you back to your country. Majority of the time this didn't happen, but this could happen. You could be sent back to your point of origin. This could separate families, a whole bunch of issues. Generally speaking, a lot of people that did arrive in Ellis Island, they ended up staying here. But there were cases where people were sent back home. Then after the first physical check, then you would get into the document check. And this would be, why are you here? Do you have any felonies in the place that you came from? Which, by the way, who's gonna say yes? Who's gonna be like, yeah, I got a felony. So they did basically a check of, do you have any prior convictions or prior things that we have to worry about? And then they had to show that they had money. The second check was the paperwork check, and I have some wealth. And then you had to explain what you were going to do here, why you're here, what work you're going to have, and kind of establish, I'm not just going to be like somebody that tries to make money off the streets. I have this skill, and I have this much money to get started. And then you'd be sent off your way. It was a long process, counting the whole trip here, as well as the physical and the document check. But once you're here, you're here. Doesn't make you an American. It makes you an immigrant here that can eventually get citizenship over a bunch of different steps that you have to take. So remember this. Ellis Island, that's on the East Coast. This is New York. This is where, German, Irish, Italian, European immigrants would come. And then Angel Island is on the West Coast. This is where you're going to get Asian immigrant experience. This is going to be, China and Japan. They're going to come from there. Those are your two different places of ports that are going to bring people in from different countries. Talk about a group of immigrants I want to talk about and their experiences, the Italian immigration, which was in the late 1800s. If you have Italian heritage, you're going to get an experience today. So what was the reasons why people didn't like them? Well, same as they didn't like German immigrants, the same reason why they didn't like Irish immigrants. They were going to take our jobs. That was one of the things they kept saying. They're going to take our jobs. They're going to take our jobs. The KKK, remember we talked about them in the Reconstruction. They were also anti-immigrant. They were definitely anti-Catholic. So they actually were spreading propaganda about how Catholics only believe in the Pope and how they're going to do horrible things to our society and we should get rid of them, blah, 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 blah. Not only did they have to worry about stuff in the papers that was anti-Italian, they had to worry about physical violence too. In New Orleans, there was a police officer who was shot, a sheriff actually, who was shot, and without evidence, a bunch of people blamed the Sicilians, which is a derogatory term against Italians. And they basically say that it must have been those Italians that killed our sheriff. No evidence, just accusation that they're the bad guy. They're the boogeyman. They're the people taking your job. They are also the people that will kill us without even a second thought. And 100 of them were arrested. Yes, 100 Italian immigrants were arrested for the crimes that had no other proof except for people saying it must be Italians. Eventually, they're released. They're found not guilty, I should say, not released. They're about to go free. They're about to be set free the next day. But while they're in jail, a mob of anti-immigrant people, including racist people like the KKK, they break into the jail and they take out 11 of these Italian immigrants. And they bring them into basically the middle of town, and they lynch them. They hang them from a tree. Because people said they were the boogeyman. They must have did it because they're different than us. And then they killed 11 innocent people. Two of those people, by the way, the 11, had nothing to do with the trial. They just happened to be in jail at the same time. Yeah. So you have this backlash of, Italian immigrants being upset about this. Of course, why wouldn't you be? Because you could be next type of situation. So, and there is eventually a change in the way we look at Italian immigrants, just like we look at German immigrants and Irish immigrants, but this is not a good thing. Next up is the Japanese and Chinese experience. Talk about this idea of the Japanese and Chinese experience. We're specifically in this part of the video, just Chinese experience. But before we get into that, I got to talk about a term that you need to know. Xenophobia. Phobia is just something that you're afraid of. Okay, so you can have arachnophobia, which you're afraid of spiders. There's a bunch of phobias. There's like Santa Clausophobia, where you're actually afraid of like Christmas stuff. So xenophobia is a fear of foreigners, people that are different. And with Italian and Irish and German immigrants, they are different in the sense they have a different culture, maybe they have different language, but as far as looking different, it was hard to tell them necessarily apart against anybody else because they're all part of the same race. They're all Caucasian. For Japanese, Chinese, and Mexican Americans in this time frame, they do not have the luxury of being able to blend in with society. Therefore, this idea of xenophobia, fear of others, leads to them being persecuted more and them being treated worse off than their other immigrant friends, like the German, Irish, and the Italian, even though we just talked about that they didn't have an easy time either. They just could hide theirs a little bit better because they were white. So let's talk about what you would see in different places real quick that would show you this idea of xenophobia, fear of foreigners. This idea that they're taking their jobs, this idea that they're going to bring in horrible influence from their country, this idea that they're going to change our culture and religion, all these different things. Here's right here is what Japanese Americans would see. Japs, keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. Japs, keep out. You're not wanted. This is signs that people posted outside their businesses, outside their homes, that Japanese immigrants would see. This right here says, we serve whites only, no Spanish, Mexicans, or Spanish or Mexicans allowed. Again, you'd see this outside of restaurants and outside of places of business. This one right here is, one second. This one right here, 38, no. There we go. This right here, Native Americans beware of foreign influence. This idea of the fear tactic, be afraid, be afraid, be afraid. This was the Know Nothing Party. This was the KKK. They're organizing this idea of be afraid, be afraid, be afraid. The irony of this is this political image right here. You can't really tell probably where you're sitting, but you'll see images of this later on, and you'll see it in the PowerPoint that I send you. But you will see here there is an immigrant trying to come into the shores of America. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people that represent United States Americans that are well-to-do. They have these nice outfits. They're saying, no, we don't want you here. But their shadows are telling a different story. The shadows of these Americans saying we don't want immigrants shows their ancestral past. It shows that their families was also an immigrant at one time. It's this dilemma, dichotomy of persecuting a group of people that you once were, or your family members once were, or you wouldn't be here if you weren't once, if your family wasn't like them at one time. Because remember, we're a melting pot. Our nation is founded on immigration. We came from Europe. Unless you're a Native American, we came from Europe or Africa or other places other than here. So let's talk about the idea of the rise in KKK, nativism, this idea of xenophobia, and how it plays into the Chinese experience. So they arrive on the West Coast, the Chinese immigrants, and they really came here for fortune. They were also put to build railroads and to work on farms and mining, domestic services, but railroads were the big thing. They were here to build railroads. And they were here to make a bunch of money. Now, unfortunately, they're said that they're the reason why that wages go down, and also they're taking our jobs. Again, the same thing you've seen already by these other immigrant groups. They're blamed for taking our jobs. Even though they only made up a 0.002% of the United States population, I don't know how many jobs they could have actually taken away from American citizens at the time. But again, it doesn't necessarily matter. It's the idea of propagating this propaganda, this hate, this xenophobia of the other, of the foreigner. Blame them for the troubles, and people will follow. Some images I want to show you about this. One, there was this Chinese Exclusion Act, an actual law passed by Congress that prevented Chinese immigration for a period of time. There's this idea of this stuff that you would see outside of places. Chinese, no. Come 10th to the streets, 7:30 Monday evening to express your opinion on a Chinese question. Shall we have Chinese? No. There again, this idea of trying to get people on your side to prevent others from moving here, specifically Chinese Americans. Hip hip hooray, Chinese excluded. This is what was posted after the Chinese Exclusion Act as a resounding, this is a good thing. Come and ratify, come everybody, no more Chinese. Democratic County Central Committee, this is trying to get people to vote for the Chinese excluded, or to voice their opinion towards the Chinese Exclusion Act. This right here, the Chinese wall around the United States of America, this idea of building a wall to keep the Chinese out. You'll see that that is something that comes up more and more, the idea of building a wall. The hate will eventually be transferred to the Japanese, and we'll talk about the Japanese experiment in just a moment. But the Chinese experience was not fun. It was not good. I want to show you one political cartoon here. This political cartoon was trying to get the Irish immigrants from trying to be afraid of Chinese immigrants. So you're trying to get one group that is being persecuted to dislike another group that's being persecuted, so then they join your side. To turn two enemies against each other, so then they're fighting each other. It shows the Irish immigrant and the Chinese immigrant eating Uncle Sam, devouring America, our ideals, our beliefs, whatever. And then it shows after Uncle Sam has been devoured by these two immigrant groups, the political cartoon shows the Chinese immigrant devouring the Irish, basically saying that once they're done destroying our culture, Irish, they're going to come for yours. This idea of this fear tactic over and over again. This right here shows Uncle Sam, Chinese Exclusion Act, in his hand, kicking a Chinese immigrant out of his lands. There's other Chinese immigrants that are being already kicked off this ledge by Uncle Sam. There's just a plethora of political cartoons that go into the hostility and the negativity towards the Chinese experience, the Chinese immigrants that are coming here. When we pick up next time, it's going to be the Japanese-American experience. Japanese immigrants came over for fortune, just like Chinese immigrants. They came actually for the gold rush. They'll settle in Hawaii and some other places on the West Coast. One of the things to note about them is these. This is a sign that would be posted outside of towns. It says, "Japs, don't let the sun set on you here. Keep moving. This is Rose Hill." Rose Hill basically putting a sign up that says, "We don't want any Japanese immigrants. Keep on walking." And you could say, well, they could still stop there. Would you feel safe to? So they would see this type of things over and over again. They would also see these type of instructions to all persons Japanese ancestry. It's basically a derogatory and belittling instructions about how they should live while they're over here. They would see this over the place. It's not about, here's what would help you. It's, here's what you need to do in order for you to stay here. And all of it was demeaning to their culture. Immigration bill is signed by the president. Japanese ban becomes effective July 1st. So there is a Japanese ban that takes place, similar to the Chinese Exclusion Act. And then we get into the Mexican-American experience of the late 1800s. And it's very similar as the other groups. You have this, they're coming over here for the promise of better jobs, the promise of better lives for their families. And because of xenophobia, because of this push to be afraid of the foreigner, you have discrimination and bigotry directed towards them in similar ways that you see with the Chinese and the Japanese, based on the language, the culture, and the way they look. So when we get back, we're actually going to get to closer to home, immigration from World War I to present, and how it changes and affects you maybe today. Immigration from World War I to present, we'll stop it throughout. We'll talk about initially during World War I and then a little bit afterwards. So you have this idea of xenophobia that's going to grow during this time period, and there are certain acts that take place, like the Immigration Act of 1917, that requires literacy. This political cartoon kind of sums it up. White immigration or Oriental immigration, you'll see that this one's barred while this one is open. And how this works is the idea of a quota system, basically taking in a number of people through different nations, percentage of each. And the one that they're really going for is the Europeans that are closely related to our ancestral immigrants. And that will limit those from Asia as well as other countries in Europe that don't share our similar ancestral background. This political cartoon shows this huge funnel where Europeans are being funneled into America via the immigration system. And then you have Uncle Sam that has a gate that covers the funnel, allowing just a few select people through. Now, if you select people, if it meets the quota of people that share our ancestry, typically people that have the more of a Caucasian complexion, as well as just share traditional things that the average American does at the time, limiting those from Asia as well as others. So there's just growing of hostility, if you will, towards people that look different than the average Caucasian American during this time. And there's laws basically placed to put barriers up for people that don't have that particular characteristic. And this takes place for over a great deal of time. The U.S. Border Patrol established to crack down. This takes place in the 1924, the U.S. Border Patrol, the one that we still have today. It's obviously changed a little bit, but generally speaking, it starts there in 1924. And this will control some of the things. Now, the compelling question, the thing I want to keep in mind is, do we share the ideas? Do we share the beliefs as a whole? If you were to put money down on one side, does America follow the idea of Emma Lazarus, or does America follow the idea of Prescott Hall? Emma Lazarus is the person that wrote the poem that's on the Statue of Liberty, give us your tithe to pour your huddled masses, yearning to be free. And Prescott Hall is saying no more illegal or no more immigrants, not illegal immigrants, just immigrants, period, in our country. Keep this in mind as we're talking about the rest of this throughout this there's actually this influx of immigration, and it's not just because people are coming over here. It's we kind of want people over here. After World War II, there is a drop in population, and we have jobs that are open that we need people to work for, and you have this influx of people coming in from Mexico taking these jobs and using these jobs, and we need them to have those jobs because it produces stuff for our country. We have the Cold War that takes place, and this actually gives us immigrants from Hungary, basically refugees. We also have refugees that come from Cuba. So you see this change in the paradigm, the way people think about immigration after World War II, and that is more welcoming than you've seen prior. Now, this will eventually change course, and this when we get to other things. But we took immigrants from Cambodia and from other places. We actually, our country established a system to find refugees from Cambodia and other South Asian countries to try to reunite families. So this is really cool stuff. We're reuniting families across. We're offering jobs for people in countries that desperately need jobs. We're offering refuge from people in Cuba that are struggling from there, and also people that were suffering from the Cold War and people from the Eastern Bloc of Europe. So you see this new change of how we look at immigration after World War II, different than those prior to this, and we're going to see what happens next. This whole immigration thing, this unit, I want you to keep in mind that the typical lines, the typical sayings, the typical phrases, the typical fear tactics, the typical worries, the every single time you hear throughout these generations of immigrants from wherever they're coming from, you hear basically the same thing. They're taking our jobs. We should prevent them from coming. That's one side of it. The other side of it is we are a melting pot, and we need their expertise in areas, and they're going to benefit our culture and our society. And then you'll see that certain groups, they started, when they first came over here, prejudice, bias. They're dealing with all of this stuff all the time, right? And eventually they are woven into our society, and they're just Americans. Whatever place they came from, eventually, generation after generation, they're just us. They're part of our melting pot. And one thing I want you to pay attention to is the idea that whoever your ancestors are, if they're German, if they're Irish, if they're Italian, if they're Japanese, Chinese, Mexican, your ancestors at one time might have been persecuted, might have been treated less than, might have been thought of been bad for our society. And at one point or another, they're just part of our society. And those issues, the thing that we are afraid of, the things that people say that they do, turns out to be just bias and prejudice that it really is. So immigration has been Now the question I keep asking you though, as a whole, do you believe our society right now is more Prescott Hall or Emma Lazarus? Talk about it in class.